Hello, and welcome to Analyzing Prophecy, the Seven Seals of Revelation. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about why prophecy is so exciting for me. Whenever I look at a prophecy that really does match or has a lot of consistent variables in it that match actual history, I ask myself this question. I ask myself, did the writers of this, and the Bible was written about 3,000 years ago, did the writers of this know what was going to happen? Did they have like a vision of what was going to happen? Or is there some type of entity that is making events go according to these writings? Something that is watching and tweaking our behavior every now and then, pushing us towards a certain type of goal? Or is it that it's just interpretation, the skewing the words to make it fit history, which is what most people think about prophecy? Or maybe it's just coincidence. It's just coincidental. And this is something that you, the listener and the viewer, will have to decide for yourself. You will have to take in what's being said and make a decision on how you feel about it. And that's totally fine. You don't have to believe in prophecy. You don't have to, totally buy what you're getting ready to hear. But at least think about it and let it marinate a little while. Well, the first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to review our last uh, video on prophecy. And we were talking about the beast of Revelation and how that beast of Revelation is actually a fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies about his four beasts. And when we talked about that, we went through some historical things that begins with the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, that incident occurred because Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came into Jerusalem and grabbed up all of the aristocracy, all of their knowledge base, everybody who was an artisan or had some type of skill. Nebuchadnezzar grabbed them up and dragged them back to Babylon. He left in place the king and all the peasants who didn't have any skills. And he figured, well, it's hard to run a kingdom without having knowledgeable people there, people who know about engineering or who know how to build things or who know um, politics or can advise the king with any type of good advice, that knows what other kingdoms are doing. All of these different skill sets that the peasants probably didn't have. So they left the king of Jerusalem sitting there on the throne. And by sometime, the last king, Zedekiah, got really fed up with being a vassal state to Babylon, and he decided to uprise. So Nebuchadnezzar got on his horse, brought his armies back to Jerusalem, grabbed up the last few remaining Israelites that were there, the king and his sons and all of that, and took them all back to Babylon. He also, in the process, destroyed the temple. And down here, this actually comes from the movie Star Wars, the Jedi temple being destroyed. But you kind of get the idea. He burned it to the ground, destroyed it. So, after Babylon, we also talked about how Media Persia, under King Cyrus, came in, diverted the waters of the Euphrates, and snuck into Babylon during one of their festivals, deep in the night, and sacked the city. It happened almost overnight. One minute it's Babylonian run, and the next minute Cyrus of Media Persia is now the king. So after Media Persia, we talked about how Greece came. And there was some type of procession. These were illustrated as three different beasts. Babylon was the lion, Media Persia was the bear, and that's because Assyria had been defeated by Babylon, and it kind of merged. So you actually had three kingdoms: Assyria, Media, and Persia, together. So the three ribs in his mouth were those three kingdoms united. Then you had Greece was the four-headed leopard, and we talked about how the four generals of Greece split the kingdom that Alexander the Great had built. He went halfway across the continent, all the way to India, just defeating everything, and they'd split everything up amongst themselves when he died. So Media Persia was defeated by Greece. And lastly, we had a fourth beast that we identified as Rome, and Rome defeated Greece. As time went on, we saw that there was no other beast. There was just this last beast that was different than all the rest, and it didn't even bother to give it a description or try to compare it to some literal animal like the other ones. But what we did find is that this beast had 10 horns on the top of its head. And the reason for that is that Rome conquered Europe. And when the Ostrogoths came down, the Ostrogoths being German, came down and took over Italy, they then they weren't like a foreign country coming in and taking over, as was with Babylon. Media Persia was a whole separate country coming in, a whole separate peoples coming in and taking over Babylon. And the same with Greece, taking over Media Persia. But with Rome during its heyday had conquered almost all of Europe, and the Germans were kind of a province that Rome was trying to get a handle on, and they considered that a part of their province of their empire, but the Ostrogoths were never really tamed. So when they came down and took over everything, well, it was a part of itself. So the 10 horns sprout up out of the head, and they represent the Holy Roman Empire, or the 10 kingdoms of Europe at that time. And then we talked about how out of the 10 horns of Europe, there was one last horn, and that horn represents the United States. It is the only country that came out of the 10 European countries that formed the Holy Roman Empire. So one of the things that we didn't talk about was the prophecy of Daniel that talked about the woman of God, which is Israel, being forced to run into the wilderness twice. And this actually did happen. We have here in 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar took the people of Israel, he took the ruling class and all the artisans and the philosophers and all of those people who had some type of knowledge or skill. He took them back to Babylon, and he left a vassal state there for a little while. And then in 587, when Zedekiah rebelled, he came back and got everybody else and destroyed the temple. And at that time, there was no one left in the land. All the Jews had been moved to Babylon, and for 70 years they stayed in Babylon. And then when the Media Persia took over under Cyrus, well, Cyrus decreed that they could go home. So, after a few years of being there under Cyrus, they were sent back to rebuild the temple. And they did that. So the temple existed there until 70 CE. This was shortly after Jesus Christ was crucified in Rome, and the Roman Emperor Titus sent his troops to take over Jerusalem, and they built a wall around Jerusalem. The people starved to death that were inside of Jerusalem, and then when they were good and weakened, he sent his troops in there. They sacked the city, killed everybody, men, women, and children, inside the city, and burned the temple down a second time. So the temple was destroyed again. The Romans made a law that no Jew would be able to step foot into Jerusalem, and it stayed like that for pretty much 2,000 years. But in the prophecy of Daniel, there is a calculation that is there, and it gives us the calculation of 2,520 days. And when we add the 2,520 days and count them as years from 605 BC, we come all the way to 1914. And this is supposed to give us the beginning of another prophecy, which corresponds to the seven seals, which we're going to talk about today. So remember that date, 1914, because it's very significant. And those of you who know history will know exactly what happened in 1914, but we'll get to that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at Revelation chapter 6 and read from there, and then go verse by verse and describe what's going on. But before we talk about the first verse, we're going to go back to chapter 5 and talk about the Lamb. Now, let's just start with verse 1. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, "Come and see." So the first thing we see is the Lamb, and the Lamb represents the common people. But before I get into that, let's go back to chapter 5, like I was saying, and talk about what happened there. It looks here as Yahweh is looking for someone that is worthy to open the seals. And John, who is looking at this, because no one is found who is worthy, begins to weep. And then they do find someone who is worthy. And they say with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power, riches, and wisdom, and strength, and honor, and glory, and blessing." And so the Lamb then sits on the throne forever and ever and ever. Well, the Lamb that is slain refers back to what happened at Passover, right? And it also refers to the ritual sacrifice. And in the ritual sacrifice, the Jewish ritual sacrifice, lambs are sacrificed for the common people. Whenever someone who is a member of the common people sin, they can either sacrifice a lamb, a goat, or 2 turtle doves. When a priest sins, he sacrifices a bull. So the lamb doesn't represent a priest. Lamb represents common people. When a king sins, he sacrifices a ram. So the lamb doesn't represent kings. It represents common people. So here we have the lamb sitting on the throne. And a lot of times we think of the lamb as Jesus Christ, and as well we should. He wanted us to. He left that image there for a reason. You see, we like to say Christ is king. And when we think of kings like the King of England, or King this or King that. And Jesus plainly told us that he didn't come here to be king like other kings are kings, where people are serving him. He came to serve other people. And he told his disciples, "The greatest among you is he that is a servant to everyone else." Now, he wasn't advocating being a slave. That was not what Jesus was talking about. But when he told his disciples that the kingdom is among you, it isn't over you or under you. What he was telling them is that you have to be responsible for the kingdom. The kingdom is within you to build. You are the kingdom. So the minute we get a king over ourselves, we're abdicating our own responsibility, our own decision making, our own autonomy. we're giving it to someone else and saying, you make the decision so that I don't have to be responsible for that. And Jesus said no, which is why when the Jews were trying to make him king, he kept running away from them. But finally, he realized that they were never going to understand. They weren't ready to take that responsibility on for themselves. So what he did is he did exactly what they wanted him to. He came into the city as a king, knowing that immediately he was going to be executed. So the lamb being found worthy has to do with people. And when the lamb sits on the throne, it's when the common people have taken the seat of authority. They're starting to make decisions. Now, this is supposed to be an indicator of when this prophecy takes place. It's during a time period when the common man has found himself in control of things. Now, up until the point of 1914, if you talk about periods before then, especially in Europe, you're talking about the countries run by kings, by queens, by royal bloodlines, by conquerors. And a lot of that has changed all over the world. You'd be hard-pressed not to find a democratically elected anything. Even in China, it is the People's Republic of China. There are elections, right? But there was still an emperor in 1914 in China. So think about these changes that occurred during this time. Now, the United States was not the first to start thinking about elections. We actually modeled our Constitution after the Magna Carta, which the aristocracy forced King John to sign. And of course, he got a little upset about that and tried to take the country back from his aristocracy, but his effort failed. So, when that first seal is opened, there's thunder. And thunder is one of the side effects of being in Yahweh's presence. There are four signs that you're in Yahweh's presence. One is the earthquake. One is fire or lightning. One is a strong wind that sounds like voices. And then there's the still small voice. And all the other three, the first three that come, Yahweh's in it, but that isn't him. And then when you get the still small voice, there's Yahweh. There you found it. Okay? So thunder is the after effect of lightning. And lightning is not only the presence of Yahweh, it is a symbolic of having an insight. And this insight isn't continuous. It's like an inspiration. You get a flash of inspiration or a flash of a vision of what things should be, and it changes what the way that you're thinking. But it's real quick. It's something that's it's like a snapshot, and bam! It's like I get it. Eureka! I understand this, and it changes the course of everything from that moment on. So there are two major outcomes that we're going to be looking for in this text, in this chapter, as we go along here. We're going to be looking for rule of the common people, this switchover, the last vestiges of monarchies being gotten rid of. And the last thing we're going to look for is the rise of the merchants. Because as we learned last time, one of the important things about the beast is represented by the locust coming out of the abyss, and locust equals merchants. And that's why the beast controls buying and selling, because it is the merchant class. So the seals are kind of the run-up to that moment, or how we got to that point. So let's move on to the first seal. And it reads, "And I saw and behold a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him. And he went forth conquering and to conquer." So here's this white horse. And the first thing we see about him is he has a bow. Well, the bow is a long distance weapon. It means that the rider is a little ways off, but he's coming. And the bow is something you use to cause effect way away down the road a piece without actually being that close to it. So it's a long distance kind of thing. So we're looking at Christ consciousness, a way of thinking that's affecting us from a ways off yet. Now, crown has to do with a governing principle. It's something that changes the way that we govern ourselves, and also what's governing us. What is the ruling principle at the time? So this rider is causing change, even though he hasn't arrived on the scene yet. And this is starting to take over our consciousness. It's changing the way that we have done things. We were doing things one way, and now we're starting to do things a different way. Later on, in chapter 19, we see that this rider is talked about again. And I'll read what it says about him as soon as I can get the page open. Pages are sticking together and not having much success here. In chapter 19, verse 11, it says, "And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God." Okay, the thing I want to take away from that reading is that this writer has a sword, and the sword is coming out of his mouth, right? He's doing battle not with a literal sword, but with words. He's changing hearts and minds. He's at war, yes, but he's changing hearts and minds. The other thing I want to bring out is that he's wearing many crowns. And that is because we the people are the lamb. We are the ones that have to, at some point, make the decision to be responsible for what we're co-creating out here. We are co-creating this. We are creating this world together. If there are people starving on this world, it is because we allow it, or because we just don't love our neighbor like we should. I think, I want a diamond ring, and so I don't really care that someone sends that little kid over there. That little kid has to go down in that diamond mine. Go get me my diamond because I want one. I want what I want. And I don't really think, it doesn't occur to me to even think, what are the consequences of me wanting this diamond ring? That some little kid over in another country is sent down and is living a really disastrous and horrible life because I want this freaking diamond. And it's not so much that we shouldn't wear jewelry or anything like that, because we have methods now where we could make that same diamond in a lab, and no one need go down into the bowels of the earth and risk their life and health for a little bauble that I'm going to put on. No one need do that. But I don't want that thing made in the lab. I don't want that, because the advertisers told me that that's not really as good as a real diamond, even though it has the same chemical composition and structure. And there's the only way that they can tell the difference is that the one made in the lab is perfect. It has a perfect lattice. It doesn't have any impurities in it. That's how they know it was made in the lab. No, no, I don't want that. I want the one that's, because then that little kid he has to go down there and get it. See, we don't think in those terms. We're very selfish beings and very short-sighted. And somewhere down the line, that will change. And more people will begin to see the wisdom of changing how we do things, how we think. And we will stop giving our power away to other people, saying, you go and make those decisions because, I don't want to be responsible I don't want to have to think about it. No, 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 no. We want to think about it. We want our crown, right? We want to be that governing principle. I want to govern myself, and I want to ensure that what's going on is not damaging the earth or other people. I want to make sure that things are equitable, that no one is living in starvation or squalor or whatever, because it's unnecessary. And I know why it's unnecessary, and I know how it's unnecessary, and I know the solutions to these issues, real solutions. And that's the point that we want to get to. So the next horse that comes along in Seal 2 is the red horse. And it goes on to say, and he opened the second seal, and I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red. And power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace away from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword. So this second horse takes peace away from the earth. Not just one little piece, not just one little country, but everywhere. And so we're getting a description of World War I. Now, World War I started because Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. He was on holiday in Serbia, and someone found out about his holiday and found a way to kill him. So Ferdinand was Archduke of Austria, and so the Austrians declared war on Serbia. And then Russia said, wait a minute, that's one of our satellites. That's, we have a treaty with them, and that's one of our allies, and so you pick on them, you got to pick on us too. So in the middle of all that, Germany, who says, don't worry, Austria, our closest neighbor, we've got your back. Germany then decides that while everybody is distracted, the Kaiser uses the opportunity to invade Poland under false, not Poland, it was Belgium. That was I'm thinking World War II. He goes into Belgium, and then after that into France, and so on and so forth. But most of Europe was divided. Here's Russia and Austria at odds with each other. And in the meantime, here's Germany sneaking around, under cover of darkness and pulling off a coup d'etat. Actually, he's taking over and annexing these different countries and making them a part of Germany. Well, eventually, the United Britain jumps into the war on the side of France, and you get a really big battle going on. And at that time, the U.S. Woodrow Wilson didn't want to be in any part of that. He didn't want any parts of that war. He's like, that's a European thing. We don't need to get involved with that. But there was another reason why the United States didn't want to get involved, and that was because up until this point, the United States was seen as like a child. Brand new civilization, not really battle proven, hasn't really proven themselves too much. Yes, we won the War of Independence. Yes, we were involved in a few conflicts since then, like the Spanish-American War and a couple of other conflicts. Yes, yes, yes. All of that is true. But we always had help from outside. The French were um, really big on helping us, and that's because a lot of the principles the United States was built on were French principles. When we talked about the rights of man and the grand experiment of men being free and not being ruled by a king, and all of these things were French ideas that we got from Voltaire and Montesquieu, and even more quietly, as it's kept, from the secret societies that were all based out of France, the Masons and the Rosicrucians and even the Templars, what was left of them. So the United States was in no big rush to get into this. This is the big boys are fighting, the grown folks, these countries that have been around for 1,000 years or more, right? They were a part of the Holy Roman Empire. They're old and civilized, and we're pretty new. We're just more. You see, we were that little horn, the one that little boop, it popped up and it's little, and all of a sudden it becomes bigger and more stout than its fellows. That was us. In the meantime, Russia is still embroiled in its conflict with Austria. And when that was over, the country was, well, it was reeling from debt and poverty. And in 1917, I believe it was 1917, Nicholas, the Tsar of Russia, abdicated. And in 1918, you had the Bolshevik Revolution. A lot of the aristocracy were killed off. Nicholas was killed. I think that he was killed. His entire family was killed shortly after he abdicated. So you had this monarchy, this long lineage of monarchies cut off in the Bolshevik Revolution for Russia. Of course, after World War One, the Kaiser, who was also this lineage of rulers over Germany and Prussia and the Prussian Empire, this long line of Prussian rulers. Yeah, in the Treaty of Versailles, there was to be no more Kaisers. Instead, we turned it into the People's Republic of Germany. So it became a republic where there would be elections, right? And that's one of the big takeaways, that after this World War, democracy had spread. This rule by the people, for the people, this idea spread. So the last of the monarchies in Europe were dismantled, not necessarily in Asia, but in Europe, gone with the wind. Third seal, the black horse. And he opened the third seal, and I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And behold, and lo, a black horse. And he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine." So when you talk about measuring out so much wheat for a penny, I know that doesn't sound like a lot. That doesn't sound like a lot, but really you're talking about famine. Um, that's the price of wheat during a famine. And when it talks about the oil and wine not being hurt, in a normal famine, let's say there's a drought and you were growing all kinds of crops. Well, your crops fail, so you don't have anything to eat. So now you have to charge this exorbitant amount of money for some wheat and barley. And there really is nothing for you to sell. It's just scarce. And so you have to sell it at a premium, a high price. But when you say the oil and wine isn't hurt, well, that means that this isn't a normal famine. This isn't something that has killed off your crops. This isn't locusts that have come descended down and eaten everything up and there's nothing left. You have oil and wine that hasn't been hurt. This is a famine by some other method. And so this corresponds to the Great Depression. The Great Depression was brought on by the 1939 stock market crash. And I've talked to some people and they said, no, maybe it was the Dust Bowl. Well, no, the Dust Bowl happened 1 year after the Great Depression started. And in fact, there was, if you do some research on the Great Depression, for 10 years prior to the Great Depression, the United States especially had this plethora of production going. It was the highest production ever in the history of the United States, and they had this great surplus of food. At the same time, the banks had decided to, decided to make credit unavailable for people to buy things. So you had a big supply of things with no one with any money or cash flow to buy it. So what the farmers started doing, because they had to get rid of this surplus, is they lowered the price. And they lowered it to such an extent that they were actually losing money. They were selling it at cost or below cost. That is, they were losing money on growing these crops. It cost them more to grow it than they could earn in profit. And that just made it worse. But there are some things that led up to this situation. The Great Depression was a worldwide phenomenon. It didn't just happen here in the U.S., it happened all over Europe and everything. And the thing that tied them together was the banks. Because globally, the banks had started taking credit and making it less and less available. In 1913, a year before the World War started, the First World War started, the Federal Reserve Act was put into place. And shortly after that, the income tax law was put into place. a lot of people don't know this, but American citizens didn't have income tax up until this time. There was one other time that we had income tax, and that was shortly after the Civil War. Congress enacted it to help pay for the Civil War, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional because you couldn't guarantee that the amount that someone who had almost no money would be a fair amount to pay in regards to somebody who had a large amount of money. So they made it illegal. Somehow, the European banking cartels, got together and they wrote this wonderful Federal Reserve Act allowing this cartel to handle the money. And it was passed into law. They met secretly at Jekyll Island. The J.P. Morgans of the world, the Rockefellers, they all met at Jekyll Island and wrote this wonderful Reserve Act, Federal Reserve Act, and it was passed that year. Basically, the income tax law puts the American people on the hook for what the government spends. We have to pay for that. And as assurance, if we don't pay for it, then as collateral, our whole country is put up for collateral. That's the agreement. It's a crazy agreement, but there it is. Now, Thomas Jefferson, long before the Federal Reserve came into being, had this to say. This is a famous quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said, "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs." And that was, again, Thomas Jefferson. But we have to also take into consideration that World War I was good for business. The United States became a monopoly of industry after World War I. You have to remember, Europe was devastated. A lot of its industrial complexes were bombed. In Britain and in France, Germany, Austria, all these places had horrible things that happened there. And they needed a little time to get their industries back up and running. And of course, we, the United States, gladly pledged our help for a price. You do have to pay us back. But, yes. And so began this production mecca. We started producing things and sending it overseas. We had high exports, and we were doing really good business those first few years there. In the 1920s began the idea of consumerism. You see, up until that point, in the United States, the mindset was being frugal. A penny saved is a penny earned. I think that was George Washington who said that. And so the idea was to save and to only buy what you need. In the 1920s, a man named Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, began to approach the government and tell them that, you really don't want what happened in Europe to happen here in the United States. See, that's what happens when the mob, the people, go crazy and they just start these conflicts. Well, first of all, the common people don't start conflicts. It's usually the elite. They see a little something they want, and so they make things happen. Hey, but he sold our government on the idea that you could control the mob by making quote unquote happiness machines. You spark in them a desire for something, and you have them focus on obtaining that desire, and you feed that desire, and you let them have some stuff. You get them to consume and consume, and as long as they're happy, they won't think about rebellion. They won't think about overthrowing the government. And this has always been a concern of governments. In Rome, they said, they held these gladiatorial games not because people at the top liked them, but they wanted to keep the mob distracted when they were hungry and out of work, and all these other issues. They didn't want them thinking about those things. So you give them entertainment. You entertain the mob. And this is well documented. I'm not making this up. But anyway, if you want to learn more about Edward Bernays and the beginning of consumerism in the United States that then spread to the rest of the world, you can. There's a good documentary called The Century of Self, and it was put out by the BBC in Europe. And excellent. It goes through all the different marketing ploys to make us want things that we never even knew we wanted. Okay, so let's move on to the pale horse. And and when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over a fourth part of the earth to kill with the sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. So in this horse, we have two riders, Death and Hell. And this corresponds to the Holocaust and World War II. Now, this is very interesting things about the Holocaust. Hitler wanted to make the Third Reich, the 1,000-year reign. And all of this was based on the history of Germany, which figured very prominently in the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, Charlemagne was not only the emperor, he was the pope. These pope emperors. Constantine was the first pope emperor. When he took over the Catholic Church, or created the Catholic Church, I should say, when he took over the Christian organization and created the Catholic Church, Constantine was a pagan. And he wanted to blend everything under one religion. And that's why it's called Catholic. Catholic means universal. There's one universal religion for everybody. So it's mixed up with everybody's beliefs. Christian beliefs mixed in, right, rubbing shoulder to shoulder with pagan beliefs. Right side by side. And all of it watered down to nothing. Right? But the Third Reich was to be more than just that. It was Germany's return to that glorious empire, that empire that stretched through all of Europe and ended in Istanbul, which is Turkey. So when we look at the European Union today, where does it go? How far does it stretch? It stretches all over Europe and ends in Turkey, because somewhere in the back of someone's mind, there's still this shape of the Holy Roman Empire, this empire that began in Italy and spread from Turkey to Britain to Germany and Greece, and encompasses that area. Um, German. One of the things that Hitler wanted to do is he wanted to be that new special people. Now the Jews always call themselves the chosen people, and Hitler wanted to be that. He wanted the Aryan race, and he said this. This is almost a quote that we're going to start a new religion, except it's based on blood, and that blood is Aryan blood. So he wanted to be that new chosen people as well. And the only way that he could do that is to destroy the old chosen people, that is, the Jews, and Christians who wouldn't go along with his new reinterpretation of this empire he wanted to build, right? So his plan involved taking over the Jewish banking cartel, the Rothschilds empire that actually started in Germany, and taking all their property. And then when that didn't seem like it was going to be good enough, actually killing all the Jews he could find, winning by attrition. So like they can't be the chosen people if there are none left, right? That's us. We're the chosen people. We are the Aryan race. So this is a very sick man. Hitler was a very sick individual, and he obviously did not understand the scriptures at all. But that really wasn't his point. He really wasn't trying to understand them. He was trying to solidify his power and create a legend for himself. There's a story about Hitler that when he first he wasn't elected. He was in the process of being elected, and something happened, and he was made chancellor. I forget the entire story of how he became the grand chancellor there, but what I do remember is that when he got into that position, the first thing he did is he went to look for the Spear of Destiny. Now, the story behind the Spear of Destiny is that it was the actual spear that pierced Christ's side and actually had his blood on it. And it was in the possession of Charlemagne, that Emperor Charlemagne, Pope Charlemagne, however you want to call him, Emperor Pope Charlemagne, who was the pride of Germany, right? This Emperor Pope. Last Emperor Pope of the Holy Roman Empire. And he found out where that spear was, and he went to Austria, the Austrian Museum, and he confiscated it. He just basically said, I have authority and I'm taking it. And he took it, and it was one of the little trinkets he was going to use to show his divinity. The reason why I am going into detail about this is because you have to understand that all these things, these events, are connected. Just because the Holy Roman Empire was 1,000 years ago, it started 1,000 years ago, and kind of crumbles around the 1500s. Just because that's true, it still is governing what we're seeing today. The European Union includes Greece and Turkey for a reason, right? Because somewhere someone is still trying to put together. They're trying to put the band back together again. It's like the Blues Brothers. They're trying to put the band back together again, and they don't know that this is done. We're done. They should let it go, but they're not going to. Somewhere during this Second World War, Italy allies itself with Germany, and for the same reason. The Roman Empire is in Italy, right? Rome is in Italy. The Vatican is in Italy. The Holy Roman Empire was its seat was in Italy. So yes, somewhat this Mussolini guy, he totally, he hears this crazy nutball plan and he allies himself with Germany. Just nuts. But the damage that they do, the damage that they do trying to get this mad hat scheme to flourish is really what's really scary about this. Now, just like the Kaiser, while all of Europe is worried about Germany and now Italy to a much lesser degree, but Germany was the real pain in the tuchus. Japan decides to pull a Kaiser. He's like, oh, all of Europe is busy. So Japan then declares war on China, invades China, does some horrible, horrible things in China. Um, Now they look over and they see the United States. The United States hasn't, just like the First World War, we're not jumping into anything too quickly. We've got our own problems. We got our Great Depression that's going on, and you know we don't want to get in the middle of any of this stuff. We're sitting on the sidelines waiting to see what happens. But Japan is a little afraid. It's like, we're going to take over all of Asia, and the United States might jump in and try to stop us. So to preempt us from doing that, they decide they're going to sink our fleet on the western side that we had in Hawaii. They're going to sink our Pacific fleet, and they did. They went and sent bombers in there. Now, no, we had an eastern fleet as well. And not only that, they really did not expect us to churn out. Our war machine really got ramped up really quickly once Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And at that point, we got into this thing. First to beat Japan down, and then to help our allies, France and Britain and the other European countries that were really having a hard time with Germany, to help them out. So we were fighting on two fronts. Yeah, Japan should probably have left us alone. We would have been a sleeping giant that would have been more than happy to just watch from the sidelines. But they just didn't want to risk us jumping in and stopping them. So, altar of the flame. So after all of this goes on, we hear about the altar of the flame. And and when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for their testimony which they held. During the Holocaust, Hitler killed 12 million Christians and 6 million Jews. That's a lot of folks. A lot of times we hear about the Holocaust and Jews. This was a religious cleansing of both Christians and Jews. Christians who would not follow this new, corrupted, totally crazy form of religious fervor that Hitler had in his mind. And so a lot of people died for their beliefs under Hitler. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on earth?" And white robes were given unto every one of them. And it was said to them that they should rest for a little season, until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. So when we talk about the Holocaust, we have to then talk about what resulted after that. Because the Holocaust was the first part of a harebrained scheme by Hitler to put the Holy Roman Empire back together again. He's a crazy nut. And as a result, we have the best estimates are that 65 to 80 million people died in World War II. That's in addition to the Holocaust deaths. This was the Second World War, and it was even larger than the first one. It truly just about spanned every nation on earth. So the slain are given white robes. Ooh. And they're told to wait a little season. But how much is a little season? You want me to wait? What is a little season? Well, we come across the idea of times and seasons in Daniel. Daniel's the one that really talks about times and seasons. And he talks about a time and times and a half time, which most Bible scholars view as 3.5 times. And there's a reason for that. Um, Daniel, who was a part of the people who were snatched up and taken to Babylon during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, was alive at the 3,500 mark from year zero if we take Adam as being a time clock. Now, a lot of people say that, that's when human beings were created. No. If you've read any of the articles that have been published out on the site, you will know that Adam was made from rubbish soil. He was made from the offer. He was made from garbage. So whatever came before him was considered to be rubbish soil or no good for building anything with. But he became Adamah, this very fertile, good to produce things with, very fertile, productive soil. So from the garbage came something productive. And that implies that humanoids could have existed before Adam. They just weren't good for building anything. They weren't at a high enough consciousness to build the kingdom. Adam was the first that could actually fit the bill. And Adam may not be an actual person. It may be a type of people. And year zero is that clock that spans the 7 times that we're given. The 7 times that were given to Cain to exist. Cain has 7 times to exist. And then time's up. No more protection for you. And that's what all this is about. So when Daniel talks about a time and times and a half time as the remaining amount of time before the end times, he's literally living at the halfway point. And they're telling him, oh, you got a time and times and a half time to go. If we look at one time as being 1,000 years, which is equivalent to one day of Yahweh, then we can calculate a season to be about 250 years. If we got 4 seasons, Jerusalem being at the same latitude as Michigan has four seasons, and I'm assuming that Jerusalem would have 4 seasons as well. And it's about a quarter of the year. So 250 years is a quarter of 1,000. And this also fits pretty well with the calculation of sundown to midnight, right? That's about 4 hours. 6 hours would be better. So maybe 2 o'clock in the morning. But that kind of fits also the prophecies that Jesus said. I will return, at midnight. Don't be sleeping. I'll be like the thief in the night. And if you're sleeping, well, you're gonna miss it. You're gonna miss my return. I'm coming like a thief in the night, right? So the timing and the hints that he gave all match up with this ideology that a season is about 250 years. That will put us in the middle of the night with this being the seventh day. And if we look at the seventh day as starting at the year 2000, for rounding things around and just rounding them up, then definitely we will be talking. It may not be in my lifetime. I may not see the Christ come, but we will see parts of this prophecy unfold in our lifetime. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about that seventh day, the day of judgment. And that has to do with the next verse. And I beheld when he opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken by a mighty wind. So, the sun becomes blackened. Like the sackcloth hair. Back in the day, sackcloth hair was made from goat hair. So lambs and goats are the two sides that the common people can have. The lamb is that which is like Yahweh, and the goat winds up being on the left hand, right? That's what Jesus said. You put my lambs over here and my goats over here. So the day of judgment is a day where the sun is darkened and the moon becomes like blood. Well, the sun stands for understanding, that the understanding needed to build the kingdom. Right now, we're at a high enough potential where we could build it. We have the technology, we have the energy available so that we could transition things into other types of energy that are renewable. We have it. But if we keep squandering the opportunity, we're going to lose the potential to build this. And that would be the equivalent of darkening the sun. Now, the Hebrew word for sun is shemesh. It is mem, which is water, and water is symbolic of peoples, nations, and tongues, surrounded by a tooth. You got a tooth on one side and a tooth on the other. And the tooth is symbolic of communication, the power of speech. So when you have all the peoples communicating together, you have understanding. That's the sun. On the other hand, the moon is equivalent to the law. The moon doesn't have any light of its own. It depends on the structures that are around it, whether or not the law is the laws are good. They can be good laws, but if the structure doesn't support the law, then the law becomes like death. I'll give you an example. There's a law that says, thou shalt not steal. It's a good law. We would all agree, yeah, you really shouldn't steal anything. You really shouldn't steal anything. It's pretty bad. But let's suppose you're living in a structure where there's a famine and there's nothing to eat. And in order to feed your family, you either starve or you take something that doesn't belong to you. In this case, because the structure doesn't support keeping the law becomes as blood. It becomes as death. To keep the law means to die or to suffer. Um, Blood also means descending. We talked about in some of the articles how Netzach or wine is symbolic of us ascending emotionally, and that blood and water is us descending emotionally, descending to greed and self-preservation and selfishness and only thinking about the self. Whereas if we get to Netzach or wine, we're considerate of other people. We have a natural high from being around other people. It is the joy of our heart. So the two things are, this says that we're going to descend emotionally more and more, descending. Another thing about the Day of Judgment happens on the seventh day, the Shabbat, the Sabbath. The sixth day, prior to the seventh day is supposed to be a day of rest. No work is to be done. On the sixth day, you have triple protection. Because, hey, if you're going to rest all the next day, you need enough so that you can survive on the sixth day. You need enough so you can survive on the seventh day. And you need a little bit extra so that as you're preparing things for the eighth day, you can survive until those things are prepared. When it comes to crops, if you start planting in the eighth, let's say this is a year, in the sixth year, you produce triple the amount. Then in the seventh year, you don't produce anything. And then in the eighth year, you have to plant, and it takes a while for things to grow, so you're still eating on that store that you stored up in the sixth day. Well, what happened is that we forgot the law, or we didn't take it seriously. And so during the sixth day, when we had the Industrial Revolution and all of that stuff, we didn't save anything. We ate it. We ate the triple production. We consumed it. And that was the prophecy about the locusts. The locusts, the merchants caused us to consume, like locusts, caused us to consume everything when we needed to save some of that. So if you imagine that the seventh day is coming and it's a day of rest, when the earth will stop producing this triple production, it'll only produce half of a normal day's production. That is, think of the world prior to the Industrial Revolution and how much we were able to produce during that time, and then half that. See, we've exploded in population and all of that stuff. So hard times are a-coming. Now, the other thing I want to say is that the law of Moses is a prophecy. So when Moses wrote about the sixth day, the triple production of the sixth day and the seventh day of rest, everything was pointing to the end times. It was written as a guidebook for how to survive the end times. So important was this time period that the entire Bible is about the end times, the seventh day, the day of judgment, and the building of the kingdom. It's entirely about that. It is about what we get right and what we get wrong. So it isn't so much this thing that the Jews do every week. They have their Shabbat and that's a tradition by law. It wasn't so much that the tradition itself is important. It was so that the action, the idea could remain unscathed. It could remain intact and its meaning intact until the time when it was supposed to be needed. That is now. So it has remained intact for 3,000 years. We're able to discuss this in its own context simply because the Jews did keep those traditions alive. And they did keep the meanings behind things alive. They took this stuff very seriously. And thank you. We appreciate that. But all of this was a warning for now. And somehow someone dropped the ball. They forgot. They allowed us to eat our triple production, or they thought that the Jews, the God of the Jews is well, he's a little nuts, and we don't have to listen to that. We don't have to take that under advisement that we need to on the sixth day store up our triple production and then dole it out over the next 2 days. So anyway, when the Bible talks about the stars of heaven falling, this isn't the angels of Satan. These are the alephs. Everything is about consciousness. We are all parts of one consciousness, and that consciousness is Yahweh. Yahweh is actually the highest expression of consciousness. But Yahweh is in the process of becoming, and it wants to become the highest it can be, the highest form of integration that we can all enjoy. All these different vantage points that it is enjoying itself from will all be in enjoyment together at the same time, moment and time. We're not there right now. Some of us are suffering great suffering, and others of us don't really care about the suffering of others. We just want what we want. We're very selfish beings. So when it talks about the stars of heaven, these we're talking about angels, angelic beings, right? These are the alephs, the messengers. And it talks about how these messengers fall like unripe figs or unready figs. What does it say exactly? It says, and the stars of heaven fell unto earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs. Untimely is the word I wanted to. So this prophecy is about the appearance of a lot of alephs. There are messengers who are speaking a message. And it's a message from the higher consciousness to this humanity. And these things are there, but they're untimely. They're here too early because they're trying to get us to avoid the worst case scenario, and that is that our selfishness and greed causes so much suffering for other people on this planet. That is not the end game of this whole thing. It's about all living beings enjoying this home and living the best life that they can live. And that means changing the way that we think and maybe getting a grasp on what we desire and why we desire it. When we talk about the fig tree, we have talked about before the two elements. The vine, which is the we get our grapes and then wine from the vine, and the fig tree. The fig tree is the mind. The grapes are the emotions. So the vine and the fig tree. Every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree. And when you talk about these figs falling from a strong wind, again, you're talking about people who are trying to change the hearts and minds of people through words. They're here as messengers. The word angel means a messenger, just as the aleph means a teacher. So these are one and the same thing. We can now go back and compare the seals to what Christ said would be the sign of his coming, right? He told his disciples exactly what they would find. And I'm not going to read the entire thing. If you want to read it yourself, it's in Matthew chapter 24. And just for safety's sake, go ahead and read the whole chapter. Put it all in context. Absorb. See how it is the same and see what things are different. Now, Jesus keeps mentioning the same elements over and over again. There are several elements that he mentions, and it's good to keep these things in mind. The first element he mentions is the false prophet. And he mentions that several times in chapter 24. He talks about take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. This is the false prophet. And the false prophets began with Constantine. Probably began even before then, even when the apostles were still roaming around. As Paul said, we already see false prophets, the Antichrist, walking around amongst us, right? But Constantine, he represents a major shift from what Jesus was trying to teach. Jesus was teaching that we should not be trying to rule over each other like kings. That's why calling him Christ, because Christ means anointed one or king. That was not his name. That's a title. And it's an oxymoron, because that's not what Jesus wanted to be. Jesus did not want to be a Christos. He did not want to be a king. He wanted to be a servant, someone who serves humanity, and we serve each other. That's why the kingdom is among us. It's not above us or below us, or, we have to have our own crown. Each person has to have their own individual crown. We can't give our responsibility for co-creating our reality to another person to do. You have to take responsibility for you. The false prophet continued into the Holy Roman Empire, because the Catholic Church, when it was established by Constantine, it continued to be the bedrock that the Ostrogoth Empire and later the Holy Roman Empire was based upon. When we talk about things like the Inquisition, the Crusades, the burning of heretics, putting people on to the torture racks and in the Iron Maiden, and all of these horrible things, all of these things were done under the auspices of emperors who took over a religious institution. An emperor does not care about your well-being. He cares about maintaining his power. And all of those things, torturing people, burning people, are all about controlling what people think, say, and do. This continued on in the 1500s. During the Crusades, the Templars were used as knights of the church, and they formed later secret orders. And these secret orders also, they're not interested in teaching people the truth about anything or teaching people about anything. It's about control. It's always about control. And that is about as anti-Christ, anti-Christos, as you can get. Anti-Jesus. It was about as anti-Jesus as you could get. So when we talk about the Templars, the Rosicrucian Order, the Masons, all of these things that were headquartered. In fact, the headquarters for the Masons and the Rosicrucian Order were the one and the same headquarters in France. The Templars were also out of France, but it was the Rosicrucian Order that started the Protestant movement to protest the Catholic Church, the Universal Church. They protested. And Martin Luther, he nailed his 21 objections onto the church doors, was a Rosicrucian. The Rosicrucian Order also started the scientific movement. When you look at Sir Isaac Newton or not Michelangelo, but Da Vinci or Copernicus or Francis Bacon. I mean, I could go on and list quote unquote famous scientists. And the only reason why they're famous is because these secret orders have kept their mind, their infamy alive because they are members of their organization. It's just like with the NAACP. You wouldn't know about Rosa Parks except that she was a member of the NAACP. Anybody else had done that, they would have just got beaten up, thrown in jail, and that would have been the end of the story. But no, she was a member of this organization, and they made sure that you knew who she was. Same thing here. So, after the coming of the false prophets, you have wars and rumors of wars. We are talking about the first four seals there. Wars and rumors of wars. Followed shortly after by the dark times. Let me read a little something from Jesus here in Matthew chapter 24. Let me see if I can find the exact okay. We're going to start here in verse 24. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even to the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So it calls those seals that we just talked about the tribulation. And then comes the dark times, when the sun is darkened and the moon doesn't give her light and the stars of the heavens fall. It's the same language. So that's the progression. Of course, after the dark times, we have the return of Christ. And there shall appear a sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So right after the dark times, then comes the return of Christ. So we are entering the dark times now. And how do we know that? We know that because we're running out of everything. We have a mass extinction event occurring where creatures in the oceans, rainforests are disappearing. All of these animals are dying off at incredible rates. The days of triple production are gone. The earth is now shrinking the supply of different things. And we're going to feel that very shortly. We are going to feel that. And that's when our potential will also go down because we didn't make the right decisions. We didn't decide to do what was in everything's best interest. We're so busy trying to get that diamond ring on our finger. We don't really care that that little kid is going down in that mine, or that we have another choice. We could get one made in the lab, but no, I got to get that little kid to go down. I got to make his life miserable so that I can be happy. We have to change that. And we should have changed that a long time ago if we were really honest about being Christians. But no, we're not. And we allow people who are no more followers of Christ than I am a follower of that dog down the street. They're not following Christ. They might pull his name out of a hat, but they're not. And this is where we have to get to that idea that we need to take responsibility for our own past by thinking about what it is that we're doing before we do it. Not afterwards, but before. How novel is that? Okay, so the next thing that happens is that the heavens depart as a scroll that when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every freeman, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? So, when we talked about the first prophecy of the beast, we saw that the abyss opened. The abyss is in Kabbalah, is a realm that exists just tangent to this physical three-dimensional universe that we occupy. And it is the lowest realm of the heavens. It is also a prison. Usually, the abyss is closed on both ends. Angels, these beings go in. They can't get down here to our level, and they can't get back up into the higher levels of the heavens. It's closed. But the abyss is open, not on the top end, but on the bottom end, allowing that mindset. It's a mindset to come filtering in to us. And that's when the Bible talks about releasing locusts. And it calls the locust merchants. Now, why merchants? Because merchants are trying to satisfy desire. And desire is born in the world of Yetzirah. Desire that what we eat, what we want to consume, what we want, that desire comes from the gut. And so releasing that, it means that all these passions and desires, things that lead to some of everything that you're seeing now, the legalization of weed, gay marriage, spend until you drop, Black Thursday, all of this stuff, all of it is born out of Yetzirah. Unleashed, unlimited desire, just run amok. And until we can get control of our own selves and not have to try to, if everybody else goes over there, they're going to eat it all up and be compulsive because we're trying to keep up with them who have no good mind or good sensibilities. We can't allow ourselves to be sucked into this. We have to think and be in control of all the parts of ourselves, our mind, our heart, our desires, and our physical body. Because unless you're in control of yourself, you can't build the kingdom where none suffers. You just can't. You let yourself be run by your belly. If your God is your belly, as it says in Philippians, if your God is what you consume, that's why fasting is so important. Fasting isn't about proving anything except to yourself that you can get control of your desires. Get them under control and stop them for at least a moment. How can you help someone else when your desires, and we don't even think about the consequences of our desires? Like I said, that diamond ring, where did it come from? What does somebody have to do to put this on my finger? We don't think about any of that. It's just I want. And that's the end of the story. So until we can get to the point where we even care about what's happening to other things that are on this planet, like I just saw the documentary, what is that show, Vice, and how in Malaysia, they're burning down at very fast rates entire rainforest to grow palm oil. For what? Who's using palm oil? Well, all the cereals and breads and stuff are made with this palm oil, and detergents and blah, blah, blah. And nobody cares. It's like whole species are being wiped out because they're burning these forests. They're putting all kinds of CO2 into the atmosphere. Nobody cares. I'm gonna still buy my bread and this. I'm not going to take responsibility and say, listen, stop using that dang palm oil so that they can stop burning down the rainforest. Please. I don't cook with palm oil myself. Why are you using it? But anyway, that's my rant for the day. Anyway, as we get further into the dark time, the insights and guidance that helps us to build the kingdom stops. Because we become focused on survival. At this rate of consumption and destruction of our world environment, there is going to come a time when ecologies collapse. We've seen it with the bees. The bee ecology has collapsed. And when they collapse, what do you think happens? There's nothing pollinating those plants that we need to survive. So they stop growing. Or maybe they grow, but they don't produce any fruit. The yield of fruit goes way, way down. And that means the amount that you have to buy, either the price is going to go up, or you're going to go to the grocery store one day and you're going to notice there are less and less varieties of stuff to buy. Now, why is that? Because you're not thinking ahead. And so when worry shifts from how do we improve civilization to how do I survive? Yeah, how do I survive is going to win out the argument. And so the dark time is about the collapse of everything that we hold dear. How do we know this? Well, it talks about the mountains being removed. And mountains in the Bible represent governments. It represents places of power that have come into being through hoarding wealth, hoarding power, and just having a structure that continuously controls a group of people. And when the mountains are removed, it means that government has crumbled. Its wealth has crumbled. It no longer has anything to sustain it. When it talks about island fleeing, well, an island is at sea level, and sea level is the common people. But when you're an island, you don't move around like common people. You're not buffeted by the same forces. You're kind of stationary. So you have enough wealth to to live amongst the people without really feeling the strain. But when the islands flee, it means that you've gone under. You don't have anything to maintain your structure of being this stable piece of land in the middle of all this flux and waves. You've gone under. You're no longer a stable anything. So when we ask the mountains to fall on us and hide us, you're asking for your wealth to protect you. You think your wealth is going to protect you. This governmental structure, it's going to protect you. Let's look again at who's asking this. And the kings of the earth, kings, the great men, the rich men, the chief captains, the mighty men, and every bondman and every freeman hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains of the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him. So we're talking about the rich, the wealthy, the people who are controlling the ebb and flow of things. They're all looking for their wealth to hide and protect them. Protect them from whom? Protect them from the Lamb. Ha! And the Lamb is the common people. Right? So when the common people have had enough, yes, well, it'll be like Greece. In Greece, when they first went into their bankruptcy, yeah, they were throwing bankers off of roofs. Yeah, it wasn't pretty. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that's what the prophecy is saying. Protect us from these people. So, Revelation is about the events that happened before Judgment Day and in great detail. It talks about the dark time or the fall of human governments. It lets us know that there's an awareness shift from monarchies to the common people. It lets us know that we're going to stop building the kingdom. But eventually, we'll get back to it. And that is the end. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment at the end of this video or under this video. You can also find us on Facebook. We're Jewish and Christian Symbology. I hope to see you. And until next time, have a good one.